This happened a little over 5 years ago. I had just moved into my first home, which I currently no longer live in. At the time, I was coming off a long stretch in a cramped downtown apartment in Spokane. Convenient location, sure, but I had grown tired of the constant traffic noise, the crowded sidewalks, and the feeling that I could hear my neighbors breathing through the walls. I wasn't a kid anymore, and I was ready for something quieter. The place I ended up renting was a small one-story home on the outskirts of some rural town, tucked behind a stretch of pine trees with a narrow gravel driveway. There is really not much else to say about it, because it wasn't much to begin with, just 2 small bedrooms, an outdated kitchen, and a cramped bathroom, but it was peaceful. The nearest neighbors were a little ways down the street. They were out of sight, and definitely out of earshot. Finding a job out there was the most frustrating thing, but I was eventually able to land one. Between the hours and the general exhaustion, I didn't have much of a routine. I mostly lived off takeout and kept to myself. No social life to speak of, which I didn't mind. This particular night happened in late October. I had just gotten home from work, maybe around 9:45 or so. It had been a long day, one of those mentally draining kinds of shifts where all you want is food and a quiet place to sit. I kicked off my boots, changed my clothes, and ordered Chinese from a spot I'd used a few times before. There weren't any delivery apps that serviced that area, so your options for food were pretty limited and depended purely on which places were willing to drive out to you. It was sometime just after 10 o'clock when the doorbell rang. I remember thinking, damn, that was fast. I walked to the front door and looked through the peephole. There was a guy standing there wearing a hoodie and jeans with his hands in his pockets, but he didn't have any food with him. No bag, no receipt, nothing that even remotely screamed delivery driver. I should have caught on to what was happening sooner, but my brain was operating on low power, and I just wasn't thinking straight. Against my better judgment, I cracked the door slightly open, keeping the chain on. I asked him if he was here with the food. He paused for a couple of seconds, then nodded, saying something about wanting to double-check the order first before grabbing it from his car. That's when I came to my senses. I told him flat out that if he didn't bring the food to the door, I was going to call the police. Instead of responding, he muttered something under his breath before turning and walking down the driveway. I watched him until he disappeared into the darkness, the whole time debating whether or not I should say something. I decided against it, which I still think was the smart thing to do. Either way, though, my gut was churning at that point. I shut the door and locked it, then grabbed my phone and called the restaurant. The manager picked up, and after I explained what happened, he told me the food hadn't even left yet. That was the moment it really clicked. Whoever had just been at my front door was some stranger with the intention of robbing the place or doing something even worse. I called the non-emergency police line and reported what happened. The dispatcher advised me to stay alert and said they'd note it for patrol. It wasn't urgent enough for a response, but it was enough to get logged, which I figured was fair since nothing actually happened. And in all likelihood, the guy had probably just left. 20 minutes later, the actual delivery guy pulled up. I took the food and paid him, and that was that. Around 11:30. I was in the living room watching TV with the lights off when I heard a noise of faint scraping sound coming from the back of the house. I muted the TV and froze, trying to be as quiet as possible. After a few agonizing seconds of silence, I heard the scraping sound again. It was coming from the back door. I was absolutely sure of it. I stared dead straight at the back of the door, and to my horror, the doorknob slightly jiggled a few times. Someone was testing it. Without another thought, I quietly called 911 and told them what was happening. I grabbed a kitchen knife and locked myself in my room, still trying to be as quiet as possible. After a good 15 minutes, an officer finally announced himself at my front door, and I rushed to let him in. The police did a search of my property and the surrounding area. No one was in sight. Despite that, one of them pointed out something near the back door of fresh pry marks. It looked like someone had tried to wedge something under the lock, probably a flathead or a pocket tool. I gave them my statement and connected it to what had happened earlier. They said patrols would be increased temporarily, but other than that, there was nothing they could do. As much as that answer dissatisfied me, I had no choice but to accept it and move on. I'd be lying if I said I slept soundly after that. But the next few nights passed without incident. I told myself there was no way that guy would return after getting the police called on him twice, and he didn't. But a few nights later, I woke up sometime after midnight to siren, police, sirens. They weren't too close, but they were loud enough to rattle me awake. I got up and went to the window just in time to see 3 cruisers fly past my house with their sirens blaring. I was glad that it had nothing to do with me, but I was still curious nonetheless. I figured it was probably some unrelated domestic thing and just went back to bed. But not 20 minutes after I had fallen back asleep, I was woken up again, this time to knock in at my front door. Groggy, I got out of bed, walked over to the door, and checked the peephole. There were 2 uniformed officers standing on the porch. When I opened up, one of them asked if I recognized someone they had just detained a few streets over. He held up his phone and showed me a photo. It was him. It was that guy from a few nights earlier, one who had tried to break into my house. I emphatically confirmed it with audible shock in my voice. Apparently, he'd just been caught trying to break into someone else's house nearby. They had him in custody and figured there was a chance there was a tie to the call I had made earlier in the week. The officers told me I wouldn't have to worry about him anymore, and I thanked them. That was the last I ever heard about it. They never followed up with me, and I never inquired. I was just happy to move on with my life and basically forget about the whole thing. I actually ended up moving out of that house shortly after that, mostly because I was going crazy living in isolation.